chasing home. The second tornado was bigger than the first. I know this because I'm a storm chaser with a PhD in atmospheric science and a Doppler radar unit mounted in my truck, and because when the rotation signature lit up my screen at 18:47 local time, showing a wedge tornado forming 2 miles southwest of a town I was supposed to have evacuated 10 minutes ago, man next to me said, "Oh no," in a voice that had nothing scientific in it at all, and somehow that was the thing that scared me most. His name was Jesse Reyes. He owned the only diner in Pryor Creek, Oklahoma, and he had not evacuated because 3 of his customers hadn't made it to their cars before the sirens went off, and he wasn't the kind of man who left people behind. I had not evacuated because I'd pulled into his parking lot to recalibrate my GPS after the first tornado scrambled the signal, walked in looking for an outlet to charge my laptop, and somehow ended up in a walk-in freezer with 6 strangers when the sirens started screaming. That was 18 minutes ago. The first tornado had already done what tornadoes do. Now we were outside, the 2 of us, flashlights, his truck, looking for a customer named Mrs. Galvez who'd gone back for her purse 30 seconds before the first rotation passed over. And my radar was telling me we had approximately 4 minutes before the second one arrived. "Tell me you see her," Jesse said. I didn't see her. I saw a parking lot covered in debris and a sky that had gone the specific green-black that means the atmosphere has run out of patience. "Get back inside," I said. "Now." "Not without." "Jesse." I put his name in my voice, the way you put weight on a structure you're not sure will hold. "She's not in the lot. She has to have gotten to shelter. We have 4 minutes, and you have 5 people in that freezer who need you to come back." He looked at the lot for 2 full seconds, the longest 2 seconds of my life, and then he ran. We made the freezer with 90 seconds to spare, which sounds like a margin until you're inside a walk-in cooler listening to a 100-year-old brick building decide whether it wants to stay attached to its foundation. And then 90 seconds feels like something you won on a bet you shouldn't have made. The EF3 hit the east side of the building. I know the classification because I had my field recorder running, because some part of my brain that doesn't know how to stop being a scientist was still logging data while the rest of me was flat on the floor with 6 strangers and Jesse Reyes' shoulder pressed against mine in the dark. The building held. Barely. I could hear it in the way the freezer walls flexed inward and back, a sound like the whole structure inhaling sharply and deciding not to exhale, in the groan of the roof taking load it wasn't designed for, in the way the floor vibrated with something that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with mass moving at speed. The retired couple from Tulsa were holding each other. The teenage girl had her eyes shut and her hands flat on the floor, pressing down like she could anchor the whole building to the earth herself. The truck driver hadn't moved or spoken since the first warning, which I would later realize was what genuine calm actually looks like instead of fear. Not stillness from shock, but stillness from someone who decided, a long time ago, that panic was simply not a tool he carried. I should describe myself here, since I tend to become the invisible one in my own stories. I'm Korean American, 24, built like someone who lives out of a truck for 3 months a year. All lean endurance and the particular patience of a person who spends entire days waiting for a storm to commit to something. My field partner calls me the calmest person in dangerous situations and the most anxious person in normal ones, which is accurate and unhelpful. Jesse had one hand on the freezer door and one hand on the teenager's shoulder. Not gripping, just there, steady weight, steady presence, the physical equivalent of "I have you." I watched him do it in the dark with a flashlight aimed at the ceiling for ambient light, and I thought, this man has done this before. Not the tornado. The holding. When the roar passed, he was the first one up, checking the other 5 people before he checked himself. The retired couple from Tulsa who'd stopped for pie, the teenage girl who'd been waiting on a friend, the truck driver who'd come in out of the first warning and not said a word since. He moved through them the way I moved through a damage survey, systematic, unhurried, looking for the thing that might be wrong before it became the thing that was wrong. "You're doing triage," I said. He looked up from where he was handing the teenager his jacket. "I'm checking on people." "Same thing. You just don't call it that." He almost smiled. which on a face still carrying those 2 seconds of parking lot, still deciding, still not entirely back from what might have happened if I hadn't said his name right, looked like the most earned thing I'd seen all week. That was when my radio crackled. And that was when the night stopped being over. "Roseman, you read?" The voice belonged to my spotter network coordinator, and the fact that she was calling meant she'd gotten a hit on my GPS tracker, which meant the cellular tower 2 miles north was somehow still standing. "I read," I said. "EF3, east side of structure, possibly a 4, pending survey. 6 survivors in shelter, all mobile." "Copy that. Listen, we've got a confirmed injury report, quarter-mile north of your position. Vehicle rollover, driver trapped, first responders are 20 minutes out minimum." Jesse was already looking at me. "I'm not a first responder," I said into the radio, to Jesse, to myself, mostly to myself. "You're the closest," my coordinator said. "And you've done the certification." "I have a wilderness first responder certification I got 4 years ago because my field sites are too remote for ambulances, and I got tired of being scared of the gap. I have used it exactly twice, both times for minor injuries. I have never used it for a vehicle rollover, in the dark, with a second tornado signature still cycling on my radar 40 miles west." Jesse was already moving toward the freezer door. "You don't have to come," I said. "You know where you're going," he said. "I know who's out there. That woman has lived in this county for 60 years. I'm not letting a stranger be the only person who tries to help her." He said her. And I understood, all at once, that he'd already figured out who the rollover report was about, and that the 2 seconds in the parking lot hadn't been indecision at all. It had been grief he was refusing to let happen before it had to. Mrs. Galvez was alive. She was also upside down in a 2019 Buick that had been pushed 30 yards off the highway by debris, with a broken collarbone she was very angry about, and a completely intact purse she was considerably more focused on than the collarbone. Getting her out took 17 minutes of careful work in the dark. Window glass already gone, door frame bent just enough to matter. A woman who weighed maybe 110 pounds made suddenly awkward by pain and physics, and the adrenaline-sharpened stubbornness of someone who had survived 73 Oklahoma summers and was not about to let one more end her. What I will say is this: Jesse held the flashlight exactly where I needed it, every time, without being told. He seemed to understand intuitively the difference between looking at a problem and illuminating it for someone else, always a half beat ahead, adjusting without asking, giving me the light, and then getting out of the light's way. He talked to her the whole time, not at her, not over her, but to her, in a steady low voice that had nothing performing in it, telling her about her nephew's baseball game last week, and whether the county fair was going to happen in September, and what kind of pie he was going to put on special tomorrow. And her breathing slowed, and her hands unclenched, and the 17 minutes went faster than they had any right to. "You always talk people through things like that?" I asked, when we had her stable on the ground, and she was busy telling Jesse he was a good boy in Spanish while I called in the report. "I run a diner," he said. "Busy lunch on a short staff. Bad news from the kitchen. Complaint from a table. The talking is the job. You just change what you're talking about. You'd be good at trauma response. You'd be good at making pie," he said, which didn't make any sense until he explained, 3 weeks later, that his benchmark for whether he trusted a person was whether he could picture them doing something patient and careful with their hands. When the call was in, he walked 10 feet away and stood with his back to me for about 30 seconds. I gave him the 30 seconds. Then I walked over and stood beside him. "She's okay," I said. "I know." A pause. "I didn't know that for 17 minutes. "I know." We stood there a little longer. The radar on my phone showed the second signature dissipating, shearing apart 40 miles west, losing its organization, becoming just weather again. The moon had come back out. I hadn't noticed when it happened. "How do you do this?" he said finally. "Drive toward them on purpose." "Same reason you stayed in that diner when the sirens went off. There are people in the way and someone has to know what they're doing." He thought about this for a moment, with the particular seriousness of someone who doesn't dismiss things just because they're said simply. That's not the same. You choose it before there are people in the way. I stay because they're already there. Is that different? I think so. I think you decided something a long time ago about what kind of person you wanted to be, and the storms are just where that decision shows up. He looked at me. I just make breakfast. The storms come to me. I almost said something about how choosing to be the person who makes breakfast for 60 years of Tuesdays was itself a kind of decision, a kind of courage that most people I knew in atmospheric science couldn't manage. But he turned his head and looked at me before I could, and the expression on his face in the half-moon light made me forget the sentence entirely. "Are you seeing anyone?" he asked, which was the last sentence I expected out of the last 10 minutes, and somehow the only one that made complete sense. I laughed, actually laughed out loud, standing in the wreckage of a state highway in Oklahoma at 9 o'clock at night. I spend April through June living out of a truck chasing rotation signatures. The last person I dated filed a missing person report the third time I drove into a warned storm instead of coming home for dinner. That's not a no. That's not a no, I agreed. He looked back at the highway. Somewhere distant, first responder lights were finally appearing. "When this is over," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man measuring a thing before he cuts it, "I want to know how you decide which storm is worth chasing." "When this is over," I said, "I want to know how you decided 60 years was long enough to know someone's name." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She orders the same thing every Tuesday. Chicken fried steak, no gravy, extra biscuit, for 11 years. He glanced at me. "You learn names when you pay attention." Something about the way he said it, simple, certain, like paying attention was just the thing you did, made my chest do something the EF3 hadn't managed. The kiss happened 2 hours later, after the ambulance had taken Mrs. Galvez to Claremore Regional, after the other 5 survivors had been collected by relieved family members, after the damage assessment team I'd called finally arrived to document the diner's east wall. We were sitting on the tailgate of Jesse's truck in the parking lot, both exhausted past the point of pretending otherwise. He kissed me the way he'd handed the teenager his jacket, simply, without making it into a declaration, like it was just the obvious next thing to do. I kissed him back the way I log a tornado path, with complete attention, because you never know when you'll get another look at something this rare. "I'm based in Norman," I said, when we finally stopped. "That's 2 hours from here." "I know where Norman is. I leave for the next system in 4 days. I know what storm chasers do. I just want to make sure you—" "Dr. Roseman!" He said my name the way I'd said his in the parking lot, with weight, with intention, with the quiet authority of someone who has run a diner for 11 years and knows how to stop a conversation from going somewhere unhelpful. I stayed in a building during an EF3 for 3 strangers and a customer who comes in on Tuesdays. I think I can handle 4 days. I didn't have a response to that. I just laughed again, and he smiled for real this time. Fully, finally, and the parking lot smelled like rain and fresh mud, and the particular clean that only comes after a storm has taken everything it wanted and left the rest standing. He drove up to Norman the following weekend, then the weekend after. By the time the season ended in late June, there was a standing invitation to the diner that the entire storm-chasing community somehow knew about. I suspect my field partner Adiz, who has a gift for disseminating information she technically shouldn't have, and Jesse's Tuesday special had quietly become 2 servings of chicken fried steak without anyone acknowledging the change. I should say something about Jesse, since I've been inside his story this whole time and haven't described him properly. He was 25, built solid and unhurried in the way of someone whose job involves carrying things and standing still and doing neither by accident. Light brown skin, dark hair that curled at the temples when it was damp from dish station steam. The kind of jaw that looked like it made decisions quietly and let other people figure it out later. He had been running that diner since his uncle handed it over 4 years ago, and showed no signs of wanting to do anything else, which was the first thing about him that surprised me, and the last thing that stopped surprising me. I am constitutionally incapable of staying in one place. He was constitutionally incapable of leaving one. Somehow this turned out to be complementary, rather than catastrophic, Mrs. Galvez sent a card from the hospital. It said, "Jesse, that young scientist of yours has good hands. Keep him." He put it on the refrigerator. I didn't ask him to take it down. My department chair, when I mentioned I was spending some time in Pryor Creek during the off-season, asked whether I'd found a new research site. I told him yes, which was technically true. I didn't mention that the site had a Formica counter and served pie and was run by someone who had once stopped a parking lot search with a single look from me and hadn't stopped being in my peripheral vision since. There's a highway camera mounted at the intersection half a mile south of the diner. Traffic monitoring equipment, drought season road condition survey. Nothing to do with either of us. And a few weeks ago it caught something in its frame that nobody at the state DOT is ever going to need for a road condition report. Jesse Reyes, kneeling on the repaired parking lot of a diner with a new east wall still faintly different, in color from the rest, holding a ring box toward a storm chaser who had driven 2 hours in non-emergency conditions and still, somehow, managed to arrive exactly on time. The timestamp reads 18:47:03. The same minute, the second tornado formed. I said yes before he'd even finished the question. Highway traffic camera, fixed angle on a rural Oklahoma intersection. Automatic timestamp, 18:47:03, golden summer evening. In the background of the frame, the parking lot of a diner with one wall slightly newer than the others. Jesse Reyes kneeling, ring box open, looking up. A storm chaser standing perfectly still for the first time in 4 months, hand already reaching down. The same timestamp as the night the second tornado formed. Caught by a camera meant for road conditions, glad for once to be pointed at something else. If you stayed through all of it, thank you. We're working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and every subscribe, comment, and share genuinely matters. Tell us in the comments which pairing you want next. We read everything. See you in the next story.